Welcome, everyone. My name is Russell Schilling I'm the Executive Director for STEM Initiatives at the U.S. Department of Education. And on behalf of the Office of Special Education and Programs and my Office of STEM Initiatives, as well as the Center for Technology and Disability, I'd like to welcome everyone who's phoned in today for our Innovations in STEM Education, Technology to Support Students with Autism webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to ask, please do not put us on hold today. Although we enjoy music, we do not enjoy music. So please, if you have to put us on hold, please just dial back in instead. To get us going, I'd like to say that the STEM office here is 2 years old, and our mission has been from the beginning to improve STEM education for all students. And that includes students with disabilities and students on the autism spectrum. I have a personal interest in this area since I have sons 15 and 17 years old who are both on the spectrum. Before I got here to the department, I was at DARPA with the DoD, and we developed some technologies out of our programs there that are now being used for job interview training systems for students with autism, being used by the Dan Marino Foundation and USC. And we also started having conversations at that time about what we needed to be doing to design software better for students with autism. And we discovered that there weren't a lot of answers to that. So one of the reasons we put this together today was to actually start this conversation up. And we really think it'll be an ongoing conversation. So not only will we be discussing universal design for learning, we'll also discuss some of the approaches to design software better for kids with autism, and then also how to use technology for students with autism to better teach STEM topics. So with that, I will introduce our 4 speakers because I'm far more uninteresting than they are. First, we have Jeff Munson from the University of Washington, whose research deals with the prognosis and interventions for autism. And he'll talk to us a bit about the use of games and some other issues in STEM education. Matt Marino from the University of Central Florida is a STEM technology specialist for kids with and without disabilities. Maya Israel from the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana will discuss a bit about universal design for learning, computational thinking, and computer science. Amelia Moody from the University of North Carolina at Wilmington will not only deal with robotics, but talk a little bit about her expertise in using technology to support children with disabilities. Before I turn it over to Jeff, I'd also like to remind everyone that at the end of this, we will be presenting a questionnaire that we would love everyone to fill out, giving us feedback about how the webinar went today. And what we could do better maybe next time. And with that, I'll turn it over to our first speaker, Dr. Jeff Munson. Jeff?
Great, thank you, Russell. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody. And to kick off this event, I'm a child clinical psychologist, and like Russell said, been involved in research not only in treatment and following the course of autism, but also in our understanding of brain development and genetics. So it's covered a wide range of things, and similarly in thinking about technology and STEM education that support students with ASD, I'm going to kind of take a broad view and review some specific examples that at my institution that we've been working on. So we're going to cover the basics really quickly. I'm going to talk about, well, what is technology and why is this so critical for students with ASD? And finally, like I said, 3 examples that I've been involved with. So first, the basics. ASD is a neurodevelopmental disorder. Its symptoms are present very early in life, certainly by age 3, and diagnosis can happen even by age 2 by a trained professional in the area. And the deficits are characterized first by social communication and social interaction difficulties. These folks don't engage with other people as readily or as easily and have sometimes less interest in doing so. Secondly, there's restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior. This could be physical movements, like rocking or repetitive hand gestures, as well as limited and focused interests that are often atypical and get in the way of their interacting with others. The current estimates of prevalence are 1 in 68, and it's far more common in boys, where you can see it's 1 in 42 in boys, but only 1 in 189 in girls. So it's a very common disorder, but it occurs across all racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups. And at this point, we have no definite diagnostic markers or biological or medical tests that we use to identify autism. It's the onset of symptoms is what tips us off in terms of that a child's development is problematic. This slide is busy, but the take-home here is that just in special education across the decades from 2000 to 2010, there's been a huge increase in autism. Corresponding, there's been a lower, a reduction in students classified with intellectual disability. So the sort of the makeup of the special education population has been changing, but some of this is, moving categorizations and focus in this population. So technology, it seems like maybe this is an obvious thing, but I was curious when I looked at the definition, some of the details here. What I want to emphasize is technology is not a screen, it's not a computer, and batteries aren't required. Rather, technology is the practical application of knowledge, or a means of accomplishing a task using knowledge. And that's just straight from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. And this is important because we got to think broadly. I hope we can think broadly about the application of technology, and that it is more than just screens and computers, although those play a central and an important role. So this is just a picture to show the complexity that all students with ASD face. They live in families, and they have relationships with peers. They're in schools. They have different medical and clinical settings. Knowledge transfer and information transfer is a challenge in this, and that all of these are embedded in the broader community and sort of our economic and business world, where we want to see these kids thrive and develop. And my focus is going to be on how we've leveraged technology to improve some of the information flow in these arenas. So first, we've got a pencil. The pencil, humble as it is an incredible piece of technology. Jean Piaget, the famous developmental psychologist, wrote, "I could not think without writing." And clearly, recording accurate information is a critical task in educational and treatment planning and evaluation. So it's not easy, though. Any of us involved in the process know how challenging this can be. So if we think about technology, what can it do for us? Let's imagine Pencil 2.0, the latest and greatest. This doctor in the cartoon says, "Good news, when we transferred your medical history to our digital system, it suddenly became legible." So the magic of technology, we hope, can simplify and improve our lives, and especially in information management is a key part. So one project that we've done here at the University of Washington was taking our 5-week full-time summer treatment program. It's essentially a summer camp for kids on the spectrum. We had 90 kids, each with individualized goals, and 40 intervention staff. And traditionally, we've had a paper-based data collection system where we record lots of details about the child's behavior and how they're progressing and treatment goals. But this year, transitioned to a tablet-based system developed by a startup company, Experiad, with a small business innovative research grant that they received from the National Institutes of Health. This Motivity program is simply a replacement for this paper-based system where 25 behaviors are tracked continuously and tied to the program's token economy system of rewards and a way to track progress students have towards their goals. They recorded 70,000 behaviors and saved 4 hours per person per week with this system. And the immediate benefit was that staff found they had more time to actually discuss treatment progress and goals, and it was based on more comprehensive and better information. Here's just a picture of it in use out on the field as kids play games. Zoom in on some of the controls. And summary reports and data visualization is just part of the package. So this freed up clinicians' time, but remember, this is information that they themselves created and had created in the past, just vastly improved its organization and availability. The second project is focused on the fact that we've seen in infant development that there's an increased presence of atypical or stereotyped motor mannerisms in babies who want to develop autism. This is, though, expensive and labor intensive. So this project seeks to take what a baby book, where we will commonly, as parents and interested grandparents and folks, record the developmental progress of kids. Here we're using sort of computer-based machine learning to track babies' movements and to record it, making a library of movements that can be early markers of potential conditions like autism and others where atypical motor development is characteristic. Here we've got information that we know we want to record, but we're going to employ technology that will allow us to record it where otherwise it doesn't really exist. So the third project focuses on what do we do when we don't have information or we don't even know what we want to record. Here, I'm going to just pause and think about not just the pros, but what are the cons of technology? Is it saving us or failing us? And I found over this past year just two examples that illustrate an optimistic view and a pessimistic view. I saw this ad in a airport. How do you turn 3.6 billion medical data points into a miracle? It goes on to say, it's simple. The answer is SAP HANA, a company that creates and builds information management systems. Very optimistic. It's amazing. A miracle, and not only a miracle, but this one's a simple miracle. Everything sounds good. There is a pessimistic view, though, on the other hand. So this is from the MIT Technology Review magazine on the cover. It said, you promised me Mars colonies. Instead, I got Facebook. A little bit let down. Mars colonies sounds so great, sounds cool, but this person here was disappointed. What was interesting to me was how these publishers communicated this optimism and this pessimism about technology. They did it with a human face. Here we see this young woman who's clearly optimistic and happy, so much that she can even close her eyes and she doesn't even need to look ahead. Just sit back and enjoy the journey. Whereas this gentleman, this is Buzz Aldrin, the astronaut, he's certainly serious, wary, maybe skeptical. You can see these are the two images I saw. He says, you promised me Mars colonies. Instead, I got Facebook. Not too pleased with this situation. What's critical, though, is the subtitle, which you probably can't read, but it says, we've stopped solving big problems. And it says, meet the technologists who refuse to give up. My work in studying children with autism, the big problem has been those who don't have much spoken language or even any communication at all. So there's a story about, not a story, but a situation. I observed a child who was given this task to solve, where does this object belong? In this pile or this pile? That's something I'm confident everyone listening knows the answer to, but this was a legitimate and reasonable task for this 10-year-old boy who was very limited in his problem-solving and communication abilities. my hope is that technology we can use to help shine a light on this situation such that we can better understand what competencies these individuals have. What struck me about this event in the class was who did get this correct, how would that success impact other people? And this much. I think technology gives us a way to change some of that. And these applications are truly unique opportunity to serve these folks with severe communication impairments that we haven't maybe thought about. This just illustrates work we've done in our group showing about 20% of kids, this is across like a 10-year time span where there's almost no gain in their communication skills. This is something that is a huge challenge to families and clinicians, educators, and we just don't know very much when someone can't communicate well with us. So to address this, I've been starting the process of building games for these students who are very minimally verbal. This is just a little screenshot of a game where the student could pop a balloon as they see themselves through using the Microsoft Kinect. You color their hand so that you have to match the color of the balloon that they're popping. Some advantages here that it's engaging. We can repeat these. We can allow these students to explore and see what questions they ask. Typical assessment settings are just often adults asking questions. Let's see how do these kids explore. Another key is that we have the ability with technology to amplify what may be a really limited skill set, such that categorizing a spoon and a fork placed in a context of a game can actually make a difference and be a positive contribution to other kids in the classroom. We also need to think, importantly, about designing. Folks with such limitations aren't going to be walking into a room turning on necessarily on their own. Focused on learning and the achievements students make, but like the graph we saw earlier, those are students who have been failing repeatedly, maybe for a decade, and families and those caring for them are really faced with a super challenging situation. These plots, I'm just busy and small, but just want to highlight the fact that the students playing this balloon pop game, on the bottom row, C and D, these are kids who are swaying, and just imagine just swaying your arms back and forth either in a vertical way or a horizontal way, that they're playing this game and solving it even though they're doing it in an incredibly inefficient manner. But the student here, letter B, he just swung his arms kind of like making a snow angel, just in front of himself, up over his head and back down, and really didn't engage with the content at all. But in talking with his sister, we saw that he liked to scribble. He liked to color with crayons. So I gave him a tablet, drew some circles myself, encouraged him to fill it in, and he didn't want to mess with that. But he did like to scribble, and he learned how to click an icon and change the color of the crayon. So this is a place where we've recorded a positive, intentional behavior that we can start from. This is something positive, something we can perhaps learn from as he progresses. These little squiggles are a similar notion that here's a game where you control the tilt of an airplane, and when he played this game, all he would do is sort of rock back and forth with this similar pattern. Couldn't play the game, but what can we learn about recording in detail and observing how it is he goes about taking part? Finally, this was an example of, again, walk you through these 5 pictures that were surprising to me when I saw them. So first he starts the level. On A, it was a simple task, lift both hands and you could pop the red and blue balloon. But B, I switched the color. So now the blue and red are on the opposite side. So in the second picture, let's just repeat what worked the last time. Lift your hands up. And then nothing happened. That was repeated 7 times. You can see on panel B, this student kept trying to pop the balloons with the wrong color. Finally, in number 4, he said, I figured it out. I've got to switch hands. But he tried a movement that was physically impossible, to reach them both simultaneously. And then only after that failed did he go to number 5 and realize, oh, let me start with the red hand, and then I'll cross over and start with the blue hand. This sort of in-depth ability to focus on a really simple behavior has the possibility of giving it into what is going on with these kids who are really struggling to learn even the basic problem-solving and communication tasks. So my hope and excitement about this is that parents, educators, clinicians, the whole gamut need to be talking to each other, transferring this information, and informing each other what are the tasks we need solving and how can technology help us. And to avoid Walt Disney's approach, this is a quote from a book about him. He had a distrust of engineers because he felt they were people who designed primarily for themselves without regard for the intended use of their product. So I don't think we need to, obviously, not shun engineers. We need to embrace them and what they have to offer, but we need to make sure they understand the challenges that we face in caring for students with ASD. So in conclusion, I think the tools we have at our disposal are amazing, and I'm looking forward to hearing even the rest of the speakers as they talk about their work in supporting students with ASD. And my encouragement is to not leave anyone out. Even these folks who haven't learned much over a decade, there's things there that we can use technology to bolster our care and service of them. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. And one more thing for the audience. We will be doing our 4 speakers first, and then we'll have some time at the end where we can open up for panel discussion. So with that, since Matt or Jeff gave us a warning about Disney, we'll be on to Orlando and the University of Central Florida with Matt Marino.
Thanks, Russ. So my name is Matt Marino. Thank you, Jeff, for that very enlightening presentation as well. My name is Matt Marino. I'm an associate professor at the University of Central Florida. And quite honestly, when I started my life as a pathobiologist, I never thought I would be in education because my father was a lifelong special ed administrator. And I never thought I would end up there, but now here I am giving a talk on students with autism, and I'm going to focus on students with games today. The target is going to be a little bit different than the folks that Jeff was talking about who are minimally verbal. The folks that I work with most are in inclusive science classrooms at the middle school level. And so we're talking about kids in grades 6 through 8 mostly. And now we've expanded some of our research to look at high school and to look at how they can expand their opportunities in STEM. So that's really what I'd like to talk to you about today. First, I have to say thank you to the Department of Ed and the National Science Foundation for funding the work I'm going to talk with you about related to games and video games specifically and students with autism spectrum disorders. And so Jeff already went over the information on this slide. I just want to clarify the PowerPoint presentation should be downloadable to you folks. So all the information that's in our slides, my understanding is you'll have access to. I've been watching the chat box, and I know that there were some questions about that, but I think it's been straightened out now. So feel free to go ahead and download the presentation. There are some slides at the end of this presentation that I'm not going to talk about, but that give you a lot of resources to STEM-specific games, and so that'll be the focus of this talk. So why would we identify students with autism and say that we need to increase their participation in STEM careers? And this is something that we're very interested in at UCF and something I've been working on for the past several years. And so the students with autism who I work with have very sustained and hypersensitive attention to detail, right? They're meticulous about the work that they do. They absolutely love the gaming environment, and they have incredibly honed skills related to their systematic approach to gameplay. And so we started thinking, how can we harness that and use it in a way that clearly, if we look at the statistics, students with disabilities are not doing well in science. And so on this slide, you can see with the 2009 standards, which we now don't have any test results yet to see how the kids are doing. You'll see I've presented the basic scores for 2009 and 2011 students with disabilities, and this is all students with disabilities, but presented here. And so if you look at them compared to their peers who do not have disabilities, you see they score much more often at the below basic level than any other level. Now that's inexcusable. We should do something about that. And so I started thinking about the kids I had in my classroom who had autism spectrum disorders, and they love to play video games, right? Whether it be Minecraft or any of the other games. And it's really interesting if you can see this slide and you look at the date, it's from 2008. And then when you look at the recent statistics, you'll see it really hasn't changed much. So there were a couple of recent studies, one out of the Pew Research Center and another one from a blog that was published by bigfishgames.com, and they looked at how often kids play games, and they found that there's still a lot of kids who are interested in playing games. And so video games help students with ASD if they follow Universal Design for Learning. So I'm going to kind of kick off this discussion of UDL, and Maya Israel is going to talk about it a little bit later on. But Universal Design for Learning is this notion that you can use multiple means of representation within a game, and you can provide multiple options for students to demonstrate their comprehension of concepts or phenomena, and you can allow students to engage with materials in a diverse way. So a game is an environment where the student can experiment and go in different directions in a dynamically changing. So on this slide, you'll see a game in the background and then all these call-out boxes. And this is a representation of what UDL looks like in a game. It's kind of hard if you know UDL and you've looked at the guidelines, you know, basically bullet points within each of the columns. But to take that and translate it into what it looks like in gameplay is challenging. So I've tried to do that for you on the next couple of slides. And I'm not going to talk about their own, but I think for students with ASD, there are a couple of these that are extremely important. The first one on this slide is in the bottom left, and it's provide modeling. They can provide modeling here options that the student is going to have with. And so as an example of this, in a non-STEM context, there's this game called the Social Express, which information related to social cues, and it annotates and gives them prompts, and they go through and do this. So there's in-game modeling appropriate social skills. That should be included in you folks' purchase related to this. Also, if you get a ability level. So if it's too challenging for the student, you want to make sure that either the game adjusts itself or you can adjust it for the student so that you can present it at the student's zone of proximal development, right? So you want to make sure that it's not too challenging or too easy for the kid, or they will not be engaged. The next slide has very similar call-out boxes, but it's a different game. And so I've done this for you so that you could see what the same type of tools, these are cognitive tools that are included in the game, might look like in different. So this is a game called Resilient Planet, which is part of the JASON project. And students would watch a video of undersea exploration, and then they could go play a game about that. The information here for students with autism that I think is most relevant is that you've got the expert avatar again, who's the scientist who provides modeling and feedback. And then you also have the camera, which our students with ASD really liked. And in addition, you have a database that provides additional information about the game environment if they wanted to go and learn something that was out of scope of what was happening in the game, or if they wanted to learn the reason behind why it is behaving the way it is. This is a screenshot of a game, a series of screenshots from a game called You Make Me Sick. And in this game, students design their own pathogens, and then they infect a host. They get to see what the pathogen looks like as it travels down into the alveoli of an individual, and then they get to see the at the cellular level. And so in about 17 minutes of gameplay, a student experiences something that is traditionally a 6-week unit in a middle school science class. It's pretty incredible. The interesting point about this is that it gives players a different perspective than they would normally have. And many of our students with ASD would look at the content materials, the traditional content materials, and see them as black and white and not understand the dynamic nature of what an infection is. And through the gameplay, they were able to articulate that. So really quickly, I will go over what the teachers really appreciated the learning tools in the games. This is something that you need to look for if you're looking for video games to use with your students as a means to either supplement their instruction or provide their instruction. There are games out there now that are strategically aligned with next generation science standards. I think that's highly important. And the important piece here is that the games spurred unanticipated discussions among the students. And so the teachers were able to prompt kids, both with and without disabilities, so with and without ASD, to stop for a minute their gameplay and have a conversation about what was happening in the game and how it related to what they were learning in their content materials. And so this is a great opportunity of instruction to these students. And with few exceptions, the students said they would rather play video games than take a traditional paper and pencil test. There was one student, very interesting from our perspective, with ASD, and it was a female, and she said that she would rather take a test. And we asked her why she would rather take a test than play a game. And she said, because it's not fair for me to take the game. It doesn't, even though it actually had proven it, and she had demonstrated mastery of the content objectives, because it wasn't a paper and pencil test, she didn't think she was actually demonstrating mastery of the content. And so that's an interesting perspective. I wish we were in person so that I could hear all your thoughts about that. But that's the way it was. So there's a few things left. And so one of the items I wanted to discuss with you was the process for implementing in your classroom. And I would say you should put on your ASD hat for a while and do an analysis of barriers that students might experience with the content, and then make sure that the games are actually going to help the student to circumvent those barriers. So that's the first step, is the barrier analysis. Then you go and you select a game based on that barrier analysis. You play it yourself as a teacher. Then you prepare the students. They play it together in teams. And when I say in teams, you need to make sure that it's not competitive, but that everyone has a role and that they're working together. And then you have a group debrief. This is a great time to have some model social skills for each other. And then you have an extension activity where they go and actually talk to someone about what's happened in the game and how they think that that's going to lead to changes in their lives. One piece that's critical here, if you're going to use games as assessment tools, is that you recognize there are two different types of proficiency within a game. There's the gameplay mechanics proficiency, which means if I want to move from one spot on the screen to another spot on the screen, do I know how to do that? And then the next piece is, if I know how to do that, I can use that information to measure the student's performance across certain benchmarks. So one of the keys to teaching with games effectively in STEM-related fields is to be able to test first whether the students actually can navigate the game in an effective way. And then you can go on to use those as assessments. On this slide, you'll see that this is a mock-up of what a student report would look like. And you can see on the left-hand side all of the digital supports that are included in the game. And you can see whether the student has used those or not. And then you get a proficiency score at the bottom of each. And so where it says M14 and M15, if you're not familiar with that, those are science standards. And then it gives you an overall proficiency as well as the amount of time that it takes in the game. And some of our folks with autism really appreciated having a certificate at the end of the game that showed what their performance was. With that, I'm going to conclude, because what I've included on these slides are links to a number of STEM games, and then there's some tables and resources for you guys. And so these tables, I apologize that they're small. They're from an article that we published in Teaching Exceptional Children about using STEM games for students with disabilities. And so we conducted an analysis of all these different video games, STEM video games. They're included for you in this table. So you can download this and blow it up so that you can look at it. And then on table 2, we have an additional apps that are included that you can use.
Okay, so today I'm going to talk about, we talked about software and we talked about universal design for learning, and so I'm going to discuss the use of humanoid robots, which is just another step in the ways technology can be used with students with autism. And I am an associate professor in early childhood and special education at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and I run the Center for Assistive Technology here. So, as Matt and Jeff mentioned, there are unique needs of students with autism, and they include complications processing facial features, attention to individual details versus overall pictures of things, difficulty understanding intonations, emotions, and feelings, issues maintaining the joint attention and engagement, difficulties self-regulating behaviors, and we know there are communication deficits. But we know they love interacting with computers, and that is what we've been discussing so far. We wanted to know, how can we take that enthusiasm that our students have for games and robotics and bridge them to humans. And so what people have come up with to bridge software and humans is humanoid robots. There's a lot of development research on these robots, and what we know is researchers work to address those unique needs that I went over earlier. And so they wanted to offer fewer avenues of communication so they could have a more targeted efforts for understanding and comprehension. They allowed students greater focus. They wanted to provide increased feedback during social interactions. And they also wanted to interactions to represent human characteristics so we could try to bridge that gap again. And then they wanted to reduce facial features because they know that it was an issue for processing. So this is an example of a Now robot on the screen, and there, some of the features include limited eye movement. So one of the ways that they've removed a lot of the complex features, and it has gentle movements of the eyelids to indicate emotions. It has human traits like arms, legs, hands. It has hands that move. It has tactile sensors for those with nonverbal communication. It has for nonverbal communication. There are fewer, simpler facial features that you'll notice. There are no eyelashes or eyebrows to reduce those complex features, and they deliver simple and straightforward communication. Here are two more examples that have been developed, and they do generally have internet accessibility and video features to record children's responses. They imitate human reactions, so you can have them dance and wave. You might have seen robots on the internet doing the evolution of dance for you, so students can get engaged and involved. They also talk and listen, so there's voice recognition software included in many of the models, and they sense when children start to get frustrated in some models and react accordingly. So there's work to assist in modulating emotions for those students. And robots right now are ranging from about $400 to $500 up to $20,000 or so. So I'm probably up from there, depending on the size and functioning. So research on the effectiveness of the design of the robots showed that some of the ideas, they've evolved. This all research started in about 2002, and they've kind of researched what's working, what's not for students. And so what they've come up with is they think it increases intrinsic motivation when using robotics during the intervention, and offered high levels of engagement. And this is very consistent with what the other presenters were saying, that there's just lots of engagement for students, and the technology is very engaging for students. They did bridge a gap that they felt between software and humans. They thought it provided interesting visual displays, and they responded to children's behavior in some therapies. If a child would get upset, for example, it would adapt what it was going to do next based on that frustration. And then it promotes social behaviors, is what the research has shown us. So here at UNCW, we did an exploratory study using humanoid robots to look at engagement and communicative initiations when compared to using software. We did a multiple baseline design. We had 5 participants. They were ages 7 to 9. I will say that most of the research being done right now is on elementary age students, and so I think what is being done for younger children can evolve into some of the older students that we're talking about that need more development in STEM to be successful in their careers. 2 subjects were lost due to attrition, so we had 1 African American and 2 Caucasian males, and the activities on their tablets included playing simple games such as Angry Birds and Mario, and on the human robotics side, we did simple games like Simon Says that were interactive but simple. We used 2 measures on engagement and communicative initiations and offered some visuals because the students, we did this at an after-school program for students, high-functioning students with autism. They required visuals to process information. They were very highly verbal. However, they had difficulties with their social responses and reactions and that behavior. An adult mediated both of the games so that we had consistency, and interactions were scripted. What we saw, if you look at these results, is that when it came to persistence, it was high across the board with either, iPad use or robotics use. But when we looked at communication, there was very little communication going on, and we did not have online gaming, so I think that brings an element of communication into these games. But we did not have it, and so there was very little communication. They were actually always in small groups when they were doing these activities, and so they might say, look, as a minimal communication, but really there was a whole lot of nothing going on until we moved into the intervention phase with the robotics, and you can just see the communication increase across the board, which I thought was interesting. So just to follow up, we started to consider robots, my students started to consider the robots as part of their community as we went on, and these are younger children, and so they really enjoyed dressing up and acting out performances, and they started to dress up the robots, as you see on the right, so they really did, accept them into their community as people to some extent. They expressed interest in programming after that. They wanted to see if they could make the robot do something different. And so we started to move towards simple programming with the students. And then we expanded that into camps and after-school programs focusing on STEM education. And we did have a focus of robotics in there, and that included Lego robots and humanoid robots. So I think there is potential for growth. Some additional research on the benefits of humanoid robots have shown that they elicit prosocial behaviors. They increase eye gaze and joint attention. They support therapies that improve social interactions, and generally speaking, that was communication and social interventions, which Jeff spoke about. Enhancing communication with adult partners as compared to software, which is really the key purpose of some of this development. And supporting social communications. It really did, in my experience, encourage interactions, and other researchers have found that as well. And interestingly enough, if there was an interaction with a human provider with a robot partner, the communication and interactions increased. So just the presence of the humanoid robot in one study seemed to show a difference in their willingness to talk and interact with adults. So it attracts their attention for sure. I think some challenges and future research ideas would be, challenges are the expense of robots today. They're going to come down and have progressively been coming down, but that would be an issue. Ease of implementation would be something to think about. Programming requirements. Most of these humanoid robots are fairly easy to program, and they're getting easier as they go because they use icons. And then there's limited research across age group and skills. Like I said, most of the research concentrated on younger children, mostly elementary. So I think what we have to ask ourselves is what ages are best to respond to the use of humanoid robots, considering the minimal skills that children require for their effective use. Skills, really the key question is, are the skills generalizable to humans? Because if that is the goal in the approach, is it working? And so that's some research that I think needs to be done. It's not very clear. And we should do it across settings and across ages to build that accumulation of research. And then lastly, how will the evolution of those robots influence research in the future, because they're continuously enhancing and making those humanoid robots much more autism-friendly. So that is all I have to talk about right now. And there's some references in there just in case.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Amelia, especially for popping up early. I believe Maya is back online now.
I am. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Not a problem.
All right, I'm going to see whether I can progress. Yep, let's see here. Oh, and look at that. It all works. So for the moment, we're all good. Sorry, and thank you for your patience. I know. We'll just keep our fingers crossed. All right, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about computer science for all, just because I'm assuming that some of the folks on this call are not as familiar with computer science education. And then quickly I'll transition into what are some challenges that students with disabilities face within this context. I'll talk a little bit about students on the autism spectrum, but really the focus of my work is on kids at risk for academic failure, kids with learning disabilities, and kind of a broad range of students who are challenged. So I don't have a specific focus on students with autism, but we just finished a case study with 3 students on the autism spectrum, so I can certainly talk to that. I want to talk about methodologies for studying computer programming and computation with students with disabilities. And then I'm going to share 4 strategies that we are studying right now that are showing promise for including kids with disability in computer science education. So the big aha for me, because my background is in special education and my work has been around technology to support kids with disability, is that when we think about computer science, we really aren't thinking about kind of a narrow view of programming in tech companies. Essentially, computer science is everywhere, and really only about half of computing jobs are in tech companies. We're seeing computing across areas such as architecture, gaming that Matt spoke about, medicine, movies, education, and advertising. And so because of that, computer science is starting to be considered as a foundational content area for all students. So when we think about STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, computing is part of the T for sure. And it's really about how do we empower children to not just consume technology and games and apps. How do we help them and empower them to be creators of those technologies for themselves? So there's a lot of statistics out there about how there are going to be more computing jobs available than there are going to be people to fill them. But really for us, it's beyond jobs. So thinking about who has access to computer science education from an equity perspective, traditionally when we think about computer science in schools, it's been seen as an enrichment activity for students who are academically advanced, or it's after school or camp activities for students who are financially privileged. And so opening up computing to all children is an equity issue. Beyond that, the idea is that you can teach a lot of real-world problem solving. You can teach persistence, collaboration, applied mathematics through computing. One of my NSF projects is looking at integrating computing and mathematics. And so we're seeing a lot of promise for teaching mathematics through computing as well. So with all that, in the United States, computer science education is not new, but over the past year, there's been a flurry of new activity, starting with January, where the president announced an initiative to bring computer science to schools across the nation. Recently, 26 governors across the country urged Congress to fund computer science education along with CEOs from both tech and non-tech industries, completely bipartisan. Both the National Science Foundation and the U.S. Department of Education have put in investments, financial investments to move computer science education to the next level. Every week I'm hearing about more districts and states, including computer science. And there's a new framework for K-12 computer science that's really looking at what the concepts and practices that we want all students to be able to experience. The problem is, among all of those, is that there's very little discourse about where students with disabilities fit in. I think that there is a huge movement to include more students in CS and computer science education, but the idea of how do we really meaningfully include students with disabilities as part of the hashtag CS for all is still something that we need to advocate for. So my research is looking at the challenges for students that students with disabilities face, coming up with new methodologies. And actually the good news is that what we're seeing is that there are strategies that support kids, even those who are really disengaged on the surface from computing. This slide just kind of shows that when we're thinking about challenges that students face, they're both instructional challenges and there are challenges inherent to computing. So the instructional challenges are things such as inaccessible curricula and software. So for example, if the software requires a lot of reading or doesn't offer opportunities for practice, if a student has a visual impairment and we're just using visual block-based programming, that software, that curricula is disabling. We're also seeing challenges around low expectations by teachers. Because computer science education is fairly new to most teachers and they're not confident in their own pedagogical approaches, when a student is struggling and that student has a disability, they're often assume that that disability is the cause for the struggle and not necessarily the curriculum or the pedagogical approaches. And lack of instructional strategies specific to computer science education. So those are the instructional pieces of it. And then there are challenges specific to computing. So if we think about what happens if somebody sits down to do computer programming, often they're trying to design something. And so it's an ill-defined problem, and it's not something that has a lot of prescribed steps that are given for the students. It requires multi-step complex problem solving and a lot of open exploration. On the one hand, that's really exciting for students and motivating and fun. On the other end, because often students with disabilities struggle in these areas, we're setting them up for failure from the very beginning. And so what we do with our research is that we start with instructional strategies that we know work in other content areas. So for example, thinking about integrating some explicit instruction into these open activities is something that we know that there's a long body of literature around explicit instruction and around universal design for learning. And so we're starting with what we already know from decades of research around what works for students who are struggling and students with disabilities. We also, all of our research is in classrooms that are highly diverse so that we can see whether what we're learning can be translated to other classrooms. And we're constantly working with teachers and administrators to make sure that the questions that we're asking are actually relevant to teachers and administrators. The programming environments, there are two types of programming environments. These two that I'm going to talk about are visual, but these aren't the only ones we look at. But we're using visually intuitive block-based programming for this particular study that I'm going to talk about now. And essentially for this, students don't need to know the text-based languages. They can still learn the concepts because those are programmed within the blocks. And so students drag and drop a pile of code and learn programming logic and problem solving without having to worry about the syntax in the program, such as Java or Python. Scratch, which is one on the left, is one of the best-known block-based programming environments. It's highly graphical. It allows users to create and manipulate two-dimensional sprites, add music, animation, other kinds of interactivity, and it's also meant to be real collaborative. Code.org is on the right. It's also a block-based programming environment, but it has a more structured teaching approach that eventually leads to more open-ended activities, but it leads them through a more structured puzzle-based environment that teach explicitly some of the computing concepts and processes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about measurement, and I'm going to try not to get stuck here, but I want to show you kind of the power of what we do and how we look at students in computing beyond just looking at the products that they're developing. We're looking at the process. We developed an instrument called the Collaborative Computing Observation Instrument, and we're using screen capture software, so we're able to see what the students are doing on the screen as well as listen to their conversations. And then we code what they do, who they do it with, and with whom within this instrument. And the kind of research questions that we can ask are things like, how are the students asking for help? Are they working individually? How long are they persisting? What kind of support are they getting? Is that resulting in any kind of success for them? And so then what ends up happening is we end up with a sequence of codes that start with when a student begins to work on any kind of task and ends when they either complete that task or they abandon that task. And then what we're able to do is take those codes and create a visual representation through directed graphs. On the right here is a real simple one where a student worked with a teacher's aide. This was a student with an autism spectrum disorder, and he was working and getting really frustrated. And so the teacher's aide, who actually didn't have a lot of expertise in computing, tried to help him when he was struggling, and he basically ignored her and eventually abandoned the task. It's not a very pretty picture, but it's one that we see fairly regularly. I'll show you a more complex one in a moment when we talk about collaborative problem solving. So the 4 instructional practices that we look at are collaborative problem solving, metacognitive self-regulation, and that's particular to when a student is stuck. What do I do when I don't know why my code isn't working? Universal design for learning, which is more class-wide based instructional approach, and then balancing explicit instruction with open inquiry. So with collaborative problem solving, what the literature shows is that we really need to teach children how to collaborate, and especially when we're talking about students with ASD and other disabilities where communication is a problem anyway, explicitly providing them the tools for collaboration is really important, modeling that. And then we're using a framework called the Collaborative Discussion Framework, where essentially we're teaching students a conversation script. So often students with disabilities, when they get stuck and they've already experienced a bunch of failure, they're going to almost insist that the teacher or their peer give them the answer. And so to combat that, what we've done is we've taught the students the script. So when a student says, I need help, or I've tried to do something, it's not working, the peer is supposed to say things like, what are you trying to do? Or what have you tried already? What would happen if? And then the students are not as verbal, the peers will say things like, I noticed that you did this. I wonder what would happen if, ... And so this has been very helpful for students, but I'm going to show you in a moment that it's really not enough. I'm going to share the story of a young man. We're going to call him Bradley. He's got an autism spectrum disorder. And for him, it was very common to have very low persistence. So almost immediately, as soon as he started programming anything, he would immediately stop, either wait for somebody to offer him help or ask for help. So here is a directed graph of 11 minutes of Bradley's interactions. And I'll talk you through this, not so much so that you completely understand the directed graph, but just so that we can highlight some of the communication and collaboration issues that students such as Bradley face. So this is a directed graph from the Collaborative Computing Observation Instrument. And essentially with this 11 minutes, Bradley tried to have 6 different interactions with his peers, his teachers, either with him asking for help or with the students offering help without his wanting to do so. He asked the peer for help twice. That's that 1A piece of it. But when he didn't ask for help very explicitly. So when we say students ask for help, we then look at the level of adaptive help seeking. Are they asking explicitly? Are they just expressing frustration and hoping somebody comes to them and offers help? So Bradley would say things like, oh, I need help, or this isn't working, or no one is helping me. And then somebody would come and help him. But because of that, his peers really didn't have a lot of guidance in how to help him because they didn't know where he was stuck. He did ask his teacher for help one time, and then 3 times the peers just noticed that he was frustrated. So when we're watching the screen capture data, we're able to see that Bradley is just having a difficult time. And so the peers would just come to him and say, what can I do to help you? Here's a little conversation. So a student came with a collaborative discussion framework and says, what are you trying to do? And Bradley says, yes, I'm trying to go up, but you put a circle, and then the peer says, what have you tried already? He goes, yeah, that worked, it worked. And the peer kind of goes, really? Let me see. And it didn't work, actually. So the peer then tries to engage with him some more, and Bradley just gets really frustrated and says, oh gosh, I can't do this. And so what we saw is that just the collaborative discussion framework wasn't enough for Bradley. These interactions did not result in any kind of real problem solving, and eventually he abandoned the task. The 15B code essentially means that he ended up, as soon as one collaborative interaction ended, he immediately went to another one, and he never actually did end up successfully solving the problem he was working on. And so the next piece that we went to is, how do we get Bradley and students like him to think about how to debug, how to problem solve, so that then when they go to a peer, they have some more tools. They will stop and thought a little bit about what they were doing. So we're teaching them explicitly how to problem solve. We can't just say to Bradley or his peers, try to debug your code. We've created some checklists with steps such as, okay, did you read your code block by block? Did any part of your code work? And they're just checking it off, saying, yes, I did this, or no, I didn't. Are there pieces here that already work that you don't need to break apart? Because what we're seeing is that students are stuck. They don't have any real strategies for problem solving, so they'll completely break apart their code and try again, and break it apart and not really have a systematic way of doing so. So this is a strategy that's starting to show some promise, especially if they take this tool and work with their peers with something in hand. The Universal Design for Learning Matt spoke about just a little bit, but this is a school-wide, class-wide intervention where we want teachers to create an environment that supports students like Bradley and his peers more proactively. So, for example, for multiple means of representation, we want to make sure that the teacher is modeling the computing lessons, creating templates, using video tutorials. And then for multiple means of action and expression, we hope that the teacher either offers, either a partially completed code, or offers a template, or offers some kind of way for a student to participate, even if they are stuck. And for multiple means of engagement, can they offer them choices in what they're programming? Can they consider the barriers to learning from the get-go and then create a learning environment that is more universally designed? When we work with teachers, what's important to know, at least with computing, is because it's such an emerging pedagogy, what we tell teachers is think about bringing in some elements of universal design for learning into instruction. Evaluate for engagement and learning. And then we know that for some students, such as Bradley, we're going to have to layer on top of that his individualized supports. And what our research is showing is that those supports that work in other content areas typically work within this environment as well. So for example, since Bradley needed some verbal prompting in math class, in English class, he would also need some verbal prompting during computer science instruction. And typically that seems to work. So for example, if a student has a behavior plan and that behavior plan is needed to keep that child on task in other content areas, that same behavior plan would probably work within this environment. Or if the student needs a one-on-one aid to support, just general problem solving, that's going to probably be needed in this environment too. And it's really helpful to teachers to know that when we tell them, you know your students, you know about good interventions. And so just think about applying those within the context of CS and then evaluate for engagement. The very last thing I'm going to talk about is balancing explicit instruction with open inquiry. And this is kind of a dichotomy, right? Because explicit instruction, we know, can reduce barriers, can reduce frustration for students with disabilities, because it's providing the steps of a process. It is explaining details, and teachers are then able to monitor student progress and give feedback. On the other hand, we just said that computing is very open-ended. So how do we actually balance these two approaches is challenging. We don't want to give too much explicit instruction so that the students don't ever learn to problem solve on their own. But we don't want to give too little so that they're experiencing too much frustration and failure and they're giving up. So here's a quick example. I'm going to talk a little bit about a teacher who wanted to teach students about conditionals. So it's providing step-by-step demonstrations, breaking down those tasks, modeling those, and then providing lots and lots of examples. We use Archer and Hughes 2011 explicit instruction, effective and efficient teaching, so those 11 explicit instruction models. And so, for example, with conditionals, which are essentially logic statements that determine program flow. So if a condition is true, you do one thing. If a condition is false, you do another thing. And that's kind of a simplification. And so what this particular teacher did is she created a worksheet of different conditionals, and the students would say, if I do my homework at night, then I'll get to play outside. Or if I clean up my room, then I'll get my allowance, or whatever it is. There were even, by the water fountain, there was this picture of, if I'm thirsty, drink for less than 3 seconds, then go back to the end of the line, which cracked me up. I just thought it was wonderful. But it's really after learning how to do this in a concrete way that you move to the abstract. So those are the 4 different strategies that we're working on. Just like Matt, I put some resources in the back. This is my email address. Everyday Computing is one of our NSF projects. We've got another one starting up, really looking at these strategies. This is a video to, it's a link to a video that we created for the STEM for All showcase for the NSF. It's 2 minutes that provides a little more information. And here are some references. So that is that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Amelia, and the rest of our panel. I think this really starts a nice discussion about the use of technology in STEM education for autistic students or students with autism, and also the whole issue of computer science and how to teach computer science and robotics. With that, I'd like to actually open it up for questions from our audience for the remainder of the time. So you can either ask questions, I guess, verbally across the phone line here, or type them in and we'll read them out loud and reply to you. And while we wait for our first question, do we have any other comments from the other panelists? So you've all had an opportunity to listen to each other. Do you have any additional comments?
This is Jeff. I just appreciate, hearing everyone's subsequent talk, how, focusing in on kids with disabilities and kids with autism in particular just highlights the incredible detail of the learning process itself that unfolds so naturally for most kids. And with this group, we're just having to, focus that natural process that's not happening and augment every little part and just be testing and trying each little component. And, it's really encouraging for me to see everything that's being done.
Okay. Well, I have a general question from Jane Brown. She says, I work with students with autism in colleges and universities. Do you have any suggestions for technology besides what we usually use, such as smart pens, voice input, et cetera?
So Russ, this is Matt, and if you go to projectican.net, that's one of the projects that I'm principal investigator of. It has a whole list of resources for college students with different types of executive function disorders, and you can probably find some resources in that website.
Great.
And I think what I would add to that, too, is there's been a lot of work about universal design for learning in higher education. So looking at some of that work as well in terms of how can I proactively address that variability, how can I provide information in different ways and allow students to express their understanding. My area is in higher education, but we could certainly put up some of those resources, too.
Okay. Well, I'll ask a general question now, too. So we've actually had a fairly wide-ranging discussion today. If we could wave a magic wand and create some research programs to answer things we don't know, what would be the major things we should be looking
at? This is Matt. I would jump in and say that we really need to do some research to determine whether we can use, and of course this has got a games slant to it, right, because of the research that I do. But I think that we could do virtual training programs for students with autism, and you and I discussed this, Russ, before everybody else came on. But I think there needs to be some specific research looking at what aspects of career preparation can lead to effective transition plans and then effective transition outcomes for students with autism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I also would add to that assessment is such a big thing. So now with the ESSA, Universal Design for Learning, being part of the law, both from a technology perspective as well as from an assessment perspective, how do we design assessments that really measure learning without that paper and pencil task? So these technologies, Jeff spoke to this at the beginning, and Matt, I think all of us spoke to this, are able to show what kids know in a way that doesn't require them to write or doesn't require them to demonstrate understanding in a way that is a traditional way. So thinking about assessment and learning and technology-mediated solutions is another area that I think would be really helpful.
So let me, let's see, do we have another question? Still waiting for another question, so I'll ask it. So if we have any software developers, say, on the call here today, do you think we have enough information to help them design software applications better for students with autism? And what other information do you think we really need to be looking at that we really don't know a lot about right now? Or maybe that's the wrong question.
Well, no, I think it's a good question. This is Jeff. I would just want to echo what Maya said, and perhaps one thing I know I want to leverage is the expertise of teachers and clinicians who work with these populations and understanding what they do that's effective and successful and giving them tools that maximize their own impact. So to some degree, we don't need to build, as we're building the software to be smart, we need to use software to capture what these experts are doing implicitly. So that's one angle, because a lot of I think the Bradley example was a great one for how it was just so challenging for him, even as people were trying to help him. So assessment is so crucial. Sometimes we got to do that before we even try to solve the problem.
Yeah. Part of what I'm thinking with the Sequoia and other instruments is, can we somehow cue the teacher that a student is struggling, because he would just get more and more frustrated. There were other students who would just sit there and actually persist unsuccessfully and not want to go and offer, ask for help. And unless there's an adult right next to them, you would know that that child is just sitting there, because, it's a technology-mediated environment. So students are in front of their computers, right? So it's very difficult as a teacher to know what's happening as students are working independently and collaboratively.
Yeah.
Maya, I think that's
across all student populations, really.
Correct.
Yeah. Well, let's move on. We do have a question. Oh, go ahead.
Russ, this is Jackie Hess. First, let me thank all the presenters for all that great information. I'm wondering, we've covered a lot about the teacher role and the peer role and the student role. I'm wondering about the parent role. Parents of students with ASD often have to or want to, but they wind up getting particularly involved in supporting their students at a lot of levels. Do any of you have thoughts about recommendations for how the parents can best support the student learning?
Well, can you hear me? This is Amelia.
Yep.
Yeah.
I would say that parents play an integral part in this because you are experts on your children, and I think that you are aware of the evidence-based strategies that work for your children. Is it visuals? Is it prompts? So how can we consider what's working for your student and translate that to educators in the school so we make sure that the interventions match what they are getting in school?
Yeah, I would agree, and I would also add to that, we work a lot with students who come from low socioeconomic backgrounds, so it's doubly challenging with technology. So having opportunities for parents and students to work together and to have, after-school programs and tech time type of experiences where the technology could be made less scary and less other is something that is helpful. I mean, there's a whole lot of issues with how do you get students and parents to come after hours, but with some creativity, it can be successful because, especially with new technologies, it's very intimidating, especially to families who are from a lower socioeconomic homes.
And I appreciate the question and agree it's such an important piece. I think parents are able to help us understand what doesn't work and the implications of trying to incorporate technology, at home when the power button goes off or, whatever the constraint is, because it's a battle. I mean, probably many of us as parents feel this tension, this push-pull with technology's role in our kids' lives, period. And I think that challenge can even be more complicated with kids with ASD. So that's there's no solution there, but I think parents, we need to know what they want solved. Because often technology can fill a role of just occupying a child in a predictable, safe way while the parent has to take a shower or cook a meal or something. And so, there's really some really tangible challenges that thinking creatively about technology can help us. And designing without much thought can exacerbate a problem potentially. Like when the power goes off and the kid melts down every time, even though the app they're working with is a real benefit.
Jeff, that's a really good point because transitions away from technology often cause issues for parents and teachers.
Yes. As a parent of two autistic students, I can vouch for that. So.
It's hard for me.
Well, do we have any other questions coming up here? We've got Linda Santos who asked something about virtual coaching for teachers. Do you see any role for helping create tools to help the teachers adapt?
Russ, this is Matt. So we're doing this project at UCF called ICANN, and what we're doing is pairing the folks who are they're certified special education teachers, and they take the secondary curriculum class, methods class with me, and we pair them virtually with college students who are in STEM majors who have registered with disability services and have an executive function disorder. And what happens is they record their interactions with the college students, and they act as coaches, and then we coach them on how they coach the college students. So it's a really interesting dynamic. By using Adobe Connect, we're able to video capture that interaction, and then we are able to review it with the secondary teacher and provide them with some feedback in a timely manner about the explicit strategies they're using to help the students. And then at the conclusion of the semester, they backwards map that. So they say, okay, if I know that in college this student might struggle in this area, I can provide compensatory strategies at the secondary level to prepare them to be successful when they go on to post-secondary school. So it's an interesting approach.
Yeah, and I think we are actually at our time limit now. So I would like to thank all of our panelists and everyone who's participated. This has been some really nice active discussions on the sidebar. And please finish our or fill out our survey and questionnaire here at the end that's posted so that we can really have feedback on how to make these events better in the future. And hopefully this is the beginning of a conversation. And we really ask for your help in pushing this particular area forward. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.